Police Department arrested 4 suspects for selling JMPD jobs for more than 100 students from different provinces. Today, the Methodist Church Women in Ministry marched against what they say has been gender discrimination against women in the church. This was brought to the fore recently when disgraced ANC Chaplain General Reverend Vukile Mahana made sexist remarks about women in the clergy. Comments that were recorded and went viral on social media. Gender issues in the church are not a new phenomena, but they are being raised more and more with incidents such as the Mahana case. To help us unpack some of these issues, I'm now joined by Nomboniso Gasa, who's a regular commentator on gender issues and other matters that affect society. Thanks so much for joining us. Welcome to the program.
Yes, hello. Good afternoon to you and the viewers.
Yes.
Happy New Year.
And a new year which has begun in many ways the way that it ended before.
Yeah.
As someone who observes and commentates on gender issues often, this wasn't a surprise for you, I'm sure.
No, it wasn't. But I think that having said that it wasn't a surprise, it was an incredible disappointment that somebody of the stature of Dr. Mahana could, in fact, feel so comfortable to say the kinds of things that he was saying, the kind of derogatory language that he used. And also we kind of got a sense that this is not only about this particular individual. It was also about his own misgivings about the fact that the Methodist Church ordains women. You know, his utter disregard and disrespect of women in the clergy, and of course women in the church itself. It was, you know, one is not surprised by these things, but there's a certain level at which you do, in fact, think, well, even if you are going to say sexist remarks, my God, to this extent, you know, it's not just what he said; it's how he said it. You know, referring to a woman who had, you know, enrobed. Yeah. A man in the church, which is her responsibility, and says, you know, potya, you know, it's not just about touching; it's about touching that he sexualizes this kind of touching, and it's always, I mean, disappointing when leaders fail, you know, to live up to the role and responsibilities that they have. Right.
So we can focus on an individual, we can even focus on a particular church, but I do think that there is patriarchy in a lot of churches.
Oh,
I mean,
absolutely.
The Catholic Church to this day will not allow a woman to be a priest. So is it something about religion in general? What is it? Because a lot of religions, even not just Christianity, put women a second citizen.
Well, it's very interesting, you know, because I'm familiar with the Anglican Church, and there's a very, very strong theology of women in the Christian Church, of feminist theologians, of really progressive theologians. And often what we find is that the men who demonstrate sexism or abuse of women, for that matter, are men who do not ascribe to doctrines such as liberation theology, are men who do not ascribe to feminist theology, are men who are not prepared to revisit their assumptions about society. And you know, if you read feminist theologians who are steeped in the Christian church, they go back, in fact, to biblical times, and they argue against the dominant patriarchy and say that the dominant patriarchy is not necessarily biblical derived. So one of the things that we have to accept is that churches are institutions. Churches are institutions of power, and that there are hierarchies of power, and wherever we find hierarchies of power, we will find discrimination and oppression of others. So I think we have to start from there. I think the second thing that we have to look at is that where there is you know, sort of like dominant patriarchal ethos, there will be sexual violations. The Catholic Church has had to deal with a lot of this, and they still refuse, I think, to actually accept the structural and the systemic wide abuse, sexual abuse in the church. So I think that when people object to women being ordained, when people object to women serving, in the pulpit, it's often linked as well to other subcultures. And that is why the Catholic Church, for example, has got such a rampant culture of sexual abuse. It's because the way in which they have designated to be the position of women in the church, or the positions of powerless people like young boys who,
yes.
And all that. So that's the one thing. The second thing is that at some point, these churches are going to have to understand that we are on this earth here and now. And, ideally, issues of the church should be looked at in terms of the canonical rules, should be looked at in terms of the canonical courts of the churches. But where they violate regulations, where they violate rights of people,
yes.
People are going to take them to the court. So in an interesting way, even though this particular match has been triggered by a specific event, I think it speaks to what is bubbling below the surface.
So I'm going to go to the Bible, because this is the book that Christians live by. And what they do is that they pick verses and so on and so forth. So Paul wrote a letter to Timothy, and in there he says, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man. She must be silent. That's 1 Timothy 2:12. It is this kind of verse that creates all of this tension, isn't it?
No, however, if you read the Bible,
yes.
If you read Christ's disciples,
yep.
and you look beyond the Last Supper, if you read it and you look at the fact that Christ goes to this woman near the river and says, please give me water, right, and has a conversation. If you look at how Christ interacts and engages with women in the gospel, you will find that it's not Timothy's letter is not necessarily
Christian.
Christian. If you look at, for example, the whole issue around, in the Romans, what is usually quoted to be a justification of homophobia. But if you look at the fact that the church itself has moved, look at the Ten Commandments. Look at the fact that at some point people used to take people as slaves. That was accepted. It's no longer accepted. So we cannot quote the Bible in verses that are convenient for us, in isolation of others. We also cannot only look at the Bible outside of the context in which we live. We live at the time of when we are no longer following the primitive church. We are following the church in the times that we do, and feminist theologians who are in fact serious Christians look at this and turn the gospel, and they argue that in the final analysis, the dignity of the person, honoring the dignity of the person, is honoring the God in you and the God that we all worship. So there is, there is no hierarchy in terms of dignity of people, and therefore the people that we believe that come from God, they should perform all roles.
We're running out of time, but this question I must ask, because as an African man, I inherit patriarchy. I mean, I've witnessed it in our house in terms of how my mother behaved with my father, and the expectation of what should happen when I now head my household, inverted commas. Is this what's happening in the church coincidentally overlapping with culture, or is it one and the same?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it obviously, you don't stop being Peter and Dora when you go to church or when you are in any other context. I think it is, and that's why even though a lot of leaders in the church are not going to be comfortable, but that's why it is important to look at the contradictions and the problems in the church and understand them as societal problems, and how we can address them together. And I think it's very important, and it's important that you are conscious of the way in which you have been socialized, and a lot of those kinds of things you don't particularly want them for your daughter, and I think that should be the starting point, that which you don't want for your children. It should inform the kind of world that you want to see.
Then they say that you've been going against your culture, you've been westernized.
I was raised by a father in a village, and he didn't necessarily follow the oppressive, dictums of so-called our culture, and we're fine. I think we are fine.
Didn't Tate Raymond have to pay lobola?
No.
I think that's where we leave it. Thanks so much for joining us, Nomboniso. It was a pleasure to talk to you.
You're welcome.
All right.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll take a quick break. In fact, let's continue now. The legendary musician and